Underhouse. Xavier bit the torch between his teeth as he pulled the gloves on. His mother stood nearby, hands clasped, looking anxious. "I'm just worried you'll get stuck." He dropped the torch into his hand and laughed. "Gee, relax. I haven't gotten that fat. You were a kid last time you went down there, there's plenty of room." He pecked her cheek, then bent down by the door that led into the crawlspace below their home. "You worry too much." Before she could argue any more, he lurched forward, through the small doorway, and into the cool, dry air of the section below their house. Despite his jovial reassurances, the space did feel a lot tighter compared to when he'd made the trip when he was 10. Back then, there'd been room to crawl, now his chest was too deep to allow him anything except scrabbling forward on his belly. The wooden beams were filled with cobwebs, long abandoned by spiders who had either starved or moved on to greener pastures. The ground was a heavy layer of dust that plumed up every time Xavier shifted. He wriggled far enough into the hole that he could no longer hear his mother's nervous breathing, then he turned on the torch. He'd lived in their small, rural property his entire life, but it was still disconcerting to try to remember the house's layout without the familiar walls and furniture to guide him. He closed his eyes and tried to visualize the route to the workroom, where a new wire needed to be threaded under a wall. The workroom was near the left side of the house, so he turned that way, creeping across the dust and breathing through his nose to keep his tongue clean. Xavier judged he was somewhere near the back of the lounge room when a large, lumpy shape by the wall drew his notice. It was a backpack, so long neglected that it had accumulated its own layer of dust. Xavier shimmied closer. He recognized the black fabric and red dragon design emblazoned down one side. Memories brought a smile to his face. He was tempted to open it, to search through the familiar contents, but reluctantly, he turned away. He had a job to do first. In the distance, a small sliver of light marked his destination. A mat of black cables looped down from between the wooden beams, then back up to disappear into the floor several feet away. Xavier wriggled to them, then tapped on the wood. "You all right, love?" his mother called from the room above. He didn't want to open his mouth and let the dust inside, but he knew she would panic if she didn't get an answer. "Fine. Okay, here we go, love." A wire appeared in the slice of light around the existing cables. Xavier rolled onto his side to grab it, then pulled it down and wriggled to where it needed to be returned to the house, one room over. His mother hurried out of the workroom and into the bedroom, her footsteps shaking down tiny streams of dust to mark where she walked. Xavier waited until she was in position before threading the wire through the hole. "Got it," she cried, and the cable was tugged from his hands. "Come back out now, love, and you can wash off all that grime." That sounded like a damn good idea to Xavier. It took him a moment to maneuver into the right position, then he began dragging himself back towards the exit. A lumpy shape, not unlike the discarded backpack, lingered near a support pillar to his left. Xavier had initially intended not to look, but his curiosity was too great, and he found himself turning towards it. A boy, long dead, lay among the dust. The mouth lolled open, showing a withered, blackened tongue, but the eye holes were empty. Blood had run from the cut throat and stained the front of his t-shirt, which had blacked with age then been softened into gray by a coating of dust. What was surprising, though, was that the body hadn't decayed. Xavier had expected Chad to turn skeletal in the decade he'd been there. Instead, he had withered and dried, almost mummified. Xavier knew better than to touch it, but he suspected the skin would be firm and leathery if he did. Thinking back to the summer he'd killed Chad, he remembered the days being almost unbearably hot. He supposed that was likely the cause. The air had been so dry, it had dehydrated the body rather than decayed it. That would explain why there hadn't been more odor. His mother had only remarked about it twice and never actually gone looking for a cause. Seeing his bully's face again after so much time, Xavier felt neither triumph nor guilt. The husk was so far from human that he barely felt anything at all. Still, he allowed himself a very slight, very small smile as he continued towards the door leading back outside. Next story. Toxic. Rita groaned and pressed her palms into her temples. The descriptions of melted skin, blinded eyes, and third-degree burns wouldn't ever leave her, she was sure. It had seemed like a cushy job when she'd taken it, be the receptionist for a remote branch of Comodoro Manufacturing, one of the country's largest chemical processing plants. The building was only used for infrequent business meetings. Most days, Rita was lucky to see another human being. Coming from the service industry, she'd thought the desk job felt like a full-time holiday. It only took half an hour to reply to emails and phone messages each morning, and Rita liked to divide the rest of her time up between browsing social media, watching online videos, and playing whatever addictive game was hot that week. At least, that had been her routine until that Monday, when she'd been given the task of compiling statistics for the company. From what she understood, the job had been delegated multiple times before it had landed in her lap. Rita had no underlings to foist the task onto. She was stuck compiling spreadsheets from the medical reports of 48 individuals who'd been involved in a malfunction at one of the warehouses in Mexico. From what she'd gleaned, a distributor hadn't followed storage guidelines, and the results were horrific. The company was simultaneously trying to keep tabs on the victims and minimize its liability. She was eternally grateful that no photos had been included in the files. The descriptions were bad enough. She created a new line on the spreadsheet, entered the patient's name, and began copying their report. Blistered burns over 35% of the body. Lost eyesight. Permanent scarring of the facial, neck, and arm tissue. The details were followed by a long list of measurements and severity markings. Rita exhaled and leaned her neck back to stretch its muscles. Her desk faced the front door of the building, which was a long, hedge-lined driveway leading to the parking lot. An elderly woman, bent double by age and wearing a shawl over her head, shuffled along the drive towards the office. Rita sat up a little straighter. She'd been told the documents were confidential. She was pretty sure it was only a legal precaution, but she still scooped up the piles and hid them in the drawer at the bottom of her desk. When Rita looked back at the glass doors, the woman was gone. Rita blinked at the empty pathway. There were no nearby buildings the woman could have gone to, no paths spearing off from the driveway. She'd simply vanished. The chair creaked as Rita rose out of it. She moved to the door and peered through, searching the path, the hedges, and the lawn surrounding it, but the area was empty. Did I imagine it? Are the medical reports actually sending me crazy? Rita shook her head and turned away from the doors. The large room felt too quiet for comfort. She switched the radio on and exhaled as it started playing some 80s tunes. I need a break. She went to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. The kettle's light blinked on, and it started to heat as Rita put a mug on the bench and fetched the milk from the fridge. The microwave's front was faintly reflective, and Rita glanced in it as she passed. She saw her face, her hand holding the milk carton, and the wobbly shapes of the kitchen appliances. And, farther behind her, the cowled figure of an elderly woman hunched against the far wall. A sharp gasp froze in Rita's throat as she swung around and dropped the milk, but the room was empty. Her hands shook, and her heart thumped painfully as she stared around herself, scrutinizing the room, then finally looked back at the microwave. She could still see her drawn, tense face in the mirror-like surface, but the woman was gone. Rita's feet were wet. She looked down to see the floor was coated with milk from the carton she dropped. She ran a trembling hand over her face and went to find a towel. There's no way the woman could have gotten into the building, she told herself as she mopped at the milk. The front door desperately needed oiling and squealed whenever it was opened. She would have heard it, even over the boiling kettle and the radio. The radio. It wasn't playing cheerful 80s tunes anymore. Instead, It made a clicking, screeching sound, exactly like a record that had gotten stuck in a scratch. Rita kept still for a long time, hunched over the wet cloth. The sound didn't change, and the longer she listened, the more she thought she could hear slow, rattling breathing in the background. Without turning her back to the kitchen's entrance, she picked up the milk-soaked cloth, placed it in the sink, then quietly walked towards the reception area. Hello. The room was empty, but the radio continued to play the same scratching noise. Rita stepped towards it slowly, feeling as though eyes were watching her. She stretched a trembling hand out and smacked the radio off. The infuriating record scratch sound seemed to echo through her head as she turned and scanned the room. This is ridiculous. Am I going crazy? Did someone get into the building without my knowing? She still had the awful creeping feeling that she was being watched as she returned to the kitchen. The half-empty milk carton waited where she'd left it on the bench, damp and slightly dented from where it had been dropped. She wiped it clean and opened the fridge's door to replace it. The fridge, compact and cheap, was scantily filled. Rita's lunch sat on the top shelf, and a few condiments and jars were lined up neatly on the third shelf. In between, nestled in the middle of the second shelf, was a dead sparrow. She almost dropped the milk again. The bird was twisted around, and the feathers were burnt from at least half of the body. She could see the thin, splitting skin below, caked with some sort of green, caustic-looking slime. The stench of chemicals reached her nose and made her gag as memories of the burn victim notes flashed through her head. The urge to be sick rose, and Rita slammed the door. She thought she heard a breathy sigh behind her but was already running for the door. The bird hadn't been there when she'd taken the milk out of the fridge. She shuddered and clutched at her face. Someone was in the building. Her desk stood between her and the front door. A stab of shock hit her as she saw the files she'd hidden in the drawer were arranged neatly over the bench, lined up one after another. A red pen had been used to scrawl huge, angry words across the pages. Murder. Guilty. Murder. Guilty. The phrase repeated over and over, sometimes so large that the letters ran off the sides of the papers and stained the desk, sometimes so tiny that they fit between the margins. Rita's head buzzed as she gawked at them. She skirted around the table, her back to the wall to give her as much space as possible. One of the pages fluttered, and she flinched, but she didn't dare avert her eyes. Her back bumped into the glass front door. She reached behind herself to twist the handle, but it was frozen. She turned. Two opaque eyes stared into hers. The age-bowed woman on the other side of the glass pulled the lace shawl off her shoulders. Her hair was burnt off, and her blistered face was caked with the green slime. Her dead eyes, bleached white, stared into Rita's. Rita screamed. She covered her eyes and staggered backwards, moving into waiting arms. Two ice-cold hands wrapped around her neck and squeezed, choking out her cry. Next story. The last bus. Raj ground his teeth as he leaned his forehead on the bus timetable and tried to read the routes. The 26, 28, and 40 stopped there, but it didn't say which ones, if any, went to Calgary. He glanced at the houses lining the street. He didn't like to think their occupants might be watching him, laughing at how obviously confused he was. The familiar tight feeling of humiliation built in his stomach, but he pushed it down. You've got nothing to be ashamed of in this neighborhood. It's only 2 steps away from being a slum, probably half the people who live here are illiterate. A squeal of tires disturbed Raj. He turned and saw, to his surprise, a bus had pulled up beside him. I didn't even hear it coming. He tried to see a direction or a number on the bus's face, but it had neither. The doors opened with a quiet whoosh. Hey, Raj said, and the driver, a plump, middle-aged man with a pleasantly smiling face, leaned towards him. Where are you heading? The man laughed. All sorts of places, kid. Where'd you want to go? Raj glanced at the dilapidated houses around him. He hadn't expected anyone who managed this sort of route to be pleasant, let alone friendly. The driver looked like the sort of person who belonged in comfortable middle-upper-class suburbs, managing a private school's bus, perhaps. Raj glanced back at the sign's map. He'd had the vague idea of going to Calgary, where one of his brother's friends lived, but he could be flexible. More than anything, he wanted to get out of the neighborhood. "You passing near Calgary at all?" "Sure am," the driver said, beckoning Raj aboard. "We're looping through a few other suburbs first, though, so it's going to be a long trip." "That okay?" Raj hesitated, one foot in the bus. A long trip meant a lot of money, which he didn't have. "How much?" The bus driver gave him an appraising look, his blue eyes scanning Raj's stained hoodie and torn jeans. "Kid, I hope I don't seem out of place saying this, but you look like you're in some sort of trouble." If an alcoholic with a raging temper and peculiar ideas about what fatherhood meant counted as trouble, then Raj was in a whole lot of it. He felt his face heat as he gave a dismissive shrug. "Hey," the driver said, and a warm smile grew over his face. "We all need a hand up sometimes. The ticket's on me." Raj didn't know what to say. He mumbled some sort of thanks as he stepped onto the bus, then the doors drew closed behind him as Raj looked for a seat. The bus held an eclectic collection of passengers. Near the front was a young, pretty woman with dyed blue hair and nose piercings. 3 rows behind her sat a businessman with a limp paper folded over his hands. A little farther back was a teenager a couple of years younger than Raj. Judging by his sickly pallor and the way he shot paranoid glances at his companions, Raj suspected he'd been dipping into some less-than-legal substances. A man who seemed to be homeless lounged against one of the windows, sleeping. 2 middle-aged women sat at the other side of the bus, near the back, knitting. And a girl with smeared mascara stared out the window with studied silence. Raj took a seat behind the pretty girl near the front and leaned back so he could rest his shoulder against the window. The girl shot him a bright smile as he passed. Raj smiled back, against his better judgment. "All settled," the driver called as he put the bus into gear. Raj felt a shock pass through him. When they'd been talking, the driver had held his hands in his lap, where Raj couldn't see them. As he'd placed them back on the steering wheel, Raj was faced with the sight of 10 long dark yellow nails. It was so bizarre and out of character for the otherwise bright and tidy driver that Raj couldn't take his eyes away. The nails were at least 3 inches long, and seemed sharpened at the tip. "Bad day?" a husky voice asked. Raj startled and turned towards the pretty girl. "What? You looked pretty deep in thought there," she said. Her voice was lower than Raj would have expected, and he found he quite liked it. A hesitant smile started to grow across his face, but he squashed it quickly. "Well, not the best, but, hey," a voice barked from farther back in the bus. "This isn't the way to Hyde Street." Raj turned to see the drugged-out kid had spoken. He looked agitated, squirming in his seat and stealing glances at the 2 knitting women who sat opposite. The bus driver glanced into his rear-view mirror, a sunny smile lighting up his face. "You're right," he said simply, then addressed the rest of the bus. "Think we've got enough?" A chorus of voices answered. "Yeah. Good for me. Let's do it." The driver took a sharp turn and picked up speed, weaving the bus through some of the darker, lesser-used lanes. Raj felt unease tickle at his stomach. He glanced at the pretty woman, who had turned in her seat to face him. Her large dark eyes crinkled into a smile. She didn't seem concerned at all. Raj turned to look at the rest of the bus. The knitting women and the businessman all looked unaffected. Only the druggie, the teenage girl with the smeared mascara, and the homeless man, who'd woken from his doze with a confused snort, seemed in any way disturbed. "What's going on?" Raj asked, turning back to the driver. He didn't recognize the area they were in, but it looked industrial. Warehouses lined the road, and he couldn't see any other traffic. "Just wait a moment," the driver said, "and you'll understand." Raj didn't want to understand. He wanted to get off the damn bus with its damn creepy occupants and its damn strange driver with his damn long nails. "What's wrong with your hands?" the druggie's voice rang out again, and Raj turned. The kid was glaring at the knitting women, who both gave him equally polite smiles. Raj leaned forward in his seat to see them more clearly, but both women had their knitted scarves draped over their hands. Raj felt, all of a sudden, that the hidden fingers were a very bad sign. He found his eyes roving the rest of the bus's occupants, checking their hands. The druggies, the homeless man's, the crying teenagers, and his own were all visible. But the knitting ladies had theirs covered with their yarn, the businessman had the newspaper draped over his, and the pretty woman in front of Raj had hers tucked into her pockets. "What?" he began. Then the bus pulled to a stop. There were no streetlights. No houses. No cars. Raj stood and prepared to bolt for the door, but the driver pressed a button, and the doors locked with a quiet click. "Let's eat," the bus driver said simply. And suddenly, all of the hidden hands in the bus were exposed as the knitting and newspapers were put away. Raj felt a scream build in the back of his throat, but he already knew no one would hear him. The creatures with long yellowed nails moved with deceptive speed. Both knitting women descended on the druggie, their jaws opening wider than a human's possibly could have as sharp, shark-like teeth extended forward. The motion was almost too fast for Raj to follow, but he caught the abortive, gurgled scream that cut off in a spray of blood. The suited man dropped his paper and leapt over the back of his seat to reach the half-asleep homeless man. The bus driver loped forward, past Raj, his eyes fixed on the terrified teenage girl. A fleck of blood hit Raj's cheek, and he turned, horrified, to find the pretty girl's dark eyes an inch from his face. "Sorry." She was smiling, but her breath was contaminated with something sick and rotten as she extended her yellow claws towards Raj. "Today's about to get an awful lot worse." Next story. House for sale. "Smile," Pam coached herself. She was watching a young couple walk through the kitchen, noting the damage to the cabinets and the broken tiles that exposed the dirty plaster beneath. "Look attentive but not obsessive. And for the love of all that's merciful, don't let them see how much you hate this house." "Do you think the owner would be open to negotiation?" Paul, the husband, asked. He had huge eyebrows that had grayed before his hair. They reminded Pam of fuzzy caterpillars. "I'm sure they would." Pam tried to inject just the right level of warmth into her voice. "They've got to think you're on their side. They've got to trust you." Paul was clearly trying not to let his interest show, but it slipped through in the way he rocked on the balls of his feet and kept glancing at his wife. Melissa, the young bride, clearly had the final say in the purchase, but she seemed interested, too. This might be it, Pam thought, beckoning her companions into the living room to show off the dusty stone fireplace and scratched wooden floors. "After 8 years on the market, I might actually sell the Hunt Street property." The house was notorious in real estate circles. No one had been able to get anything more than vague curiosity since it was listed for sale. During that time, the house had deteriorated. Stains crept down the plaster walls, and water damage peeled up the bases of the cupboards. That wasn't the main reason the house remained empty, though. "It would make a great project for anyone interested in home improvements," Pam said, sneaking a glance at Paul. He seemed the sort of person who fancied himself a handyman, and his eyes lit up at the prospect. "It's going to be a lot of work," Melissa said. "Come on, Melissa, don't nuke this on me. I could really do with the commission." "I've been looking for a hobby to take up on the weekends," Paul supplied, and Pam beamed at him. Melissa didn't answer. The door at the back of the living room had caught her attention. "What's through there?" "The basement," Pam said, stepping forward. Would you like to see inside? Please say no. Please say no. Please say no. Sure, Melissa said, and it took a lot of effort for Pam to keep the smile on her face. Absolutely. She'd never been into the basement. She'd never had any desire to go into the basement. But if the newlyweds wanted to see it, who was she to say no? It hasn't been opened in a while, Pam said, searching through her keyring. The keys were all old, bronze and partially rusted, though they had plastic tags to list which rooms they unlocked. It might be a bit mildewy down there. Melissa's hand fluttered to her belly, which had the barest hint of a bump. Ah, so it's going to be a family home, then. I'm not sure it's a place I'd want my kids growing up in, but if they want to take it off the market, I won't complain. Pam had gone through her keyring without finding the basement tag, so she started sorting through it again, more carefully. Sorry. I can't seem to find it, that's fine. Melissa turned away from the door, to Pam's great relief. Can we see upstairs, instead? Absolutely. Smile, smile, smile. They knew the house's history, Pam reminded herself as she climbed the stairs. The law said her real estate company couldn't sell the house without disclosing any facts that could dissuade a buyer. And, boy, the Hunt Street property has enough facts to write an encyclopedia. The steps creaked under Pam's sneakers, and tiny sprinkles of dust fell from the ceiling. She tried not to touch the railing or the wall. The house had always felt dirty to her. She knew the crime scene cleaning team had been thorough, but even so, the building felt tainted in a way that no amount of bleach could cure. Don't let them see it affecting you. Let them think it's a nice fixer-upper with a quirky history. If you can make this sale, you'll never have to think about the house again. In the top floor, Pam led the couple through the bedrooms as quickly as she could without looking as though she were rushing them. Here's the master bedroom. That's where Mr. and Mrs. Bowlett were murdered in their sleep by an unknown assailant. He used an axe, did you know? Apparently, the blood sprayed all up that wall there and dripped off the ceiling. The crime scene cleaners had to strip the room entirely and tear up most of the floorboards to purge it. Through here is the children's bedroom. Pam gave Melissa an extra bright smile and a knowing wink. Little Frankie Belle's blood ran through the mattress and stained the floor. Please don't Google search for the pictures. I did, and I'd give anything to forget them. And the spare room. It was a pretty, airy area. The killer's message, scrawled in blood across the opposite wall, had been scrubbed and painted over. Sometimes, when Pam glanced at the wall out of the corner of her eye, she imagined she could still see the words there. This house is mine. For years of hunting, for years of failed or inconclusive DNA testing, and 4 years of the police chasing increasingly flimsy tip-offs had all been in vain. The killer had never been found. That chilled Pam the most. The crimes had been terrible, yes, but the potential that they could be echoed in another home, with another family, still, it didn't seem to bother the newlyweds. They were more interested in the dirt-cheap price and how large and well-situated the building was. The atmosphere, which made Pam's skin crawl every time she crossed the threshold, didn't seem to touch them. Pam pretended to gaze out of the window at the aged elm tree in the backyard while the couple talked in hushed tones behind her. Paul loved the house. His eyes were bright, and he was gesticulating erratically, apparently talking about the modifications they could make to turn it into their dream home. What was more, he seemed to be winning Melissa over. The mother toad gave a small nod, and Pam sensed it was her cue to step forward. "We'd like to make an offer to your owner," Melissa said. Pam tried to keep her smile from becoming too wild. "Did I seriously do it? After 8 years, am I finally getting the Hunt Street house off my list?" "Absolutely," Pam said, ushering them out of the room and towards the stairs. She was desperate to get outside and away of the toxic aura saturating the building. "How about we go over the details in my office? I'll make you a lovely cup of tea while we work out your offer. As they headed towards their cars, Paul and Melissa into a van that had clearly been bought with the intention of expanding their family, and Pam into her Mini that let her park in even the most choked city streets, Pam stole a final look at the Hunt Street property. Its gloomy facade stared back. No, it's more than gloomy. It's menacing. Even the windows, from the high attic arches to the little square that belongs to the basement, look grim. The basement window. Pam did a double take, but the window was empty. She felt her mouth open a fraction as her heart rate shot up and sweat slicked her palms. I didn't imagine that, did I? Ready? Paul asked, and Pam knew for certain her smile was shaky. You're so close, Pam. Don't lose the sale. Of course, she said, sliding into the front seat of her car, trying to erase the image of the sallow, furious face watching them through the basement window. Next story. Diogen. Pasco sat near the back of their small canoe, one hand braced on the side of the boat and the other holding the motion picture camera as steady as he could. Behind him, Guide used a long pole to slide their canoe through the marshy water systems. It wouldn't be clear in the black and white film, but the surrounding landscape was 1,000 shades of green. Gray-green lichen hung like giant curtains of lace from the towering moss-coated trees. Clouds of tiny shimmering insects hovered above the water's surface, setting up a constant drone that steadily worked itself into Pasco's brain. A little to the left, he instructed Guide, pointing in the direction he wanted to ensure the message got through. Guide spoke just enough English to be hireable, but no more. Communication was so difficult that Pasco still hadn't figured out his ward's name. The short, perpetually smiling man responded to the title, Guide, though, so that was what Pasco called him. Guide obediently turned the boat, and Pasco let the camera pan across the landscape. Details like the scum floating on the water's surface and the bird calls wouldn't come across in the theatrical release. Even so, the landscape was dramatic enough to earn him a good sum for the footage, even if he never found the Diogen. Rumor had it that a giant water creature resembling a crocodile lived in the swamps of Venezuela. The legends contradicted each other more often than they concurred, but all agreed the ancient beast was more than twice as long as a man and had rows upon rows of vicious teeth. When he'd started the expedition, Pasco had been thrilled to discover that Guide claimed to have knowledge of the Diogen. Of course, after hiking across the country for 3 days, Pasco had realized Guide would have sworn he was capable of flying to the moon if he thought it would earn him a few coins. Still, the local was pleasant and eager to please, and he hadn't tipped Pasco or his expensive equipment into the water, yet. Pasco raised his head from the camera and squinted at a dark shape in the distance. Guide, what's that? That? Yes, Guide said, misunderstanding and directing the boat towards the dark shape. Pasco sighed but didn't bother trying to explain himself. As the craft drew closer, weaving through the thin, drooping trees, Pasco saw it was a structure made from rocks, almost like a small mountain rising out of the water. Perhaps there's a system of caves running through it. That would make excellent film. Pasco waved his guide to the left and felt a thrill at the sight of the cave opening not far ahead. Its dark rock arched high above the water and was filled with stalactites. The audiences will love this. I could even claim this was the Diogen's home and that I encountered the fearsome beast in the darkness. Inside, he told Guide, and bent behind his camera to direct its lens over the rock formations and glistening stone. A steady wind blew through the caves, ruffling Pasco's hair and drying the sweat on his face. He knew that meant the caves likely continued for a long way and probably had another opening farther into the water systems. They wouldn't be able to travel that far, though. The camera could only capture film when there was a certain amount of light. Pasco had brought a large lamp, but even that wouldn't be strong enough to penetrate the repressive darkness. Pasco let the boat drift deeper into the cave, going farther than he knew the camera would capture. His curiosity was gaining on him, and he raised his head in wonder as he gazed at the moss-coated stalactites and stalagmites. The wind blew tiny insects into his face, but he hardly cared. Guide gasped sharply, then yelled something in his native language. Pasco turned towards him. "What's the matter with you?" The short man was gesticulating wildly and speaking in broken English. "Sir. Sir. Air. Big air, comes fast here, goes fast there. What on earth are you saying?" Pasco leaned one arm on the side of the boat as he frowned. Guide had lost his perpetual smile and was digging his pole into the water, trying to draw the boat back towards the exit. Then the cause of his assistant's alarm struck Pasco, and he turned back to the cave with mingled shock and incredulity. The wind's direction had changed. When they'd entered the caves, it had been coming from deep inside the tunnel. But while he'd been engrossed in examining the walls, it had changed to blow in from the outside. Almost like breathing. Pasco turned towards the cave's entrance and saw the stalactites, no, he corrected himself, the teeth, descend to block out the light. Next story. Bunker. James frowned as he poked the tip of his walking stick into the soft ground. The last thing he'd been expecting to see in the vast Marrumbungi National Park was concrete. He'd gone off-trail to get a closer look at a huge gum tree that had been half-strangled in vines, and from there, it had been all too easy to follow a trail of small blue flowers farther into the forest. When he'd pushed through the thick vegetation and into a glade, James had been hoping for a natural clearing or possibly even a spring. Instead, he found something that definitely didn't belong so far from civilization. The concrete stood a little higher than his head and rose from the ground at an angle, like a misplaced art exhibit. James approached the shape and stepped around it carefully. He quickly realized why the structure was sloped. On the other side, which was straight and horizontal, was a door. "It's a stairwell, then. But to where?" James glanced back the way he'd come. He could still just barely see the vine-choked gum tree, but he was a good way off the regular trail. The stairwell's builder had apparently wanted it to stay hidden. And judging by the moss growing across the door's handle, that was exactly what had happened. James didn't expect it to open, but he tried the door, anyway. The plain metal handle felt cold and slimy. He gave it a tug and was surprised to find the door hadn't been locked. It was gummed in place after years of neglect, but he was able to worm it open a crack with a few good pulls. Stale, repulsive air came through the gap. It carried undertones of rot and death, and James pressed the back of his sleeve across his nose to block out the smell. What on earth is this place? James didn't have a torch, but he'd brought a camera with flash, so he raised it to the narrow opening and took a picture of the inside. The photo flashed up on his camera, and he saw stained concrete walls and dirty concrete stairs leading downwards. The angle was bad, though, and he couldn't see the stairs end. Is it some sort of military bunker, maybe? James pocketed the camera and pulled on the door again, trying to widen the gap. Dirt and organic debris had built up around the doorframe, but it ground open slowly. Once the opening was barely wide enough for a human to fit through, James stepped back, panting, and held his camera inside for another photo. The new picture was a little clearer, though his efforts to open the door had stirred up long still dust, which became white blobs in the flash. The stairs continued for what seemed like a long way. Clearly, no one had ventured through the door in many years, possibly even decades. James cast a final glance in the direction of his trail, then slipped through the narrow doorway. The noises inside were magnified so that James's footsteps sounded like echoing thunder, no matter how carefully he placed them. He stuck to the left wall and ran his hand across the cold concrete as he followed the stairs. The narrow band of light from the outside world didn't penetrate far into the blackness, so after a dozen steps, James took another photo. It showed 20 stairs more, then a landing. As he moved deeper, James tried to guess how far down the structure went. I'd have to be well under the forest by now. possibly even under the tree roots. The air chilled, and he was shivering by the time he reached the landing. Rounding the corner, he saw the stairs continued. He shook his head, dumbfounded, as he took another photo of the new stairwell. The disturbed dust was too thick for him to see any sort of end, though. What the hell is this place? James's heavy breathing mingled with the echoes of his footsteps as he followed the stairs deep underground. He paused every 5 or 6 paces to take a new photo and ensure he wasn't about to walk into a wall or fall off the edge of a drop-off. At last, after more than 100 steps, the path leveled out into a corridor. James took a photo and examined it, struggling to see through the floating dust. The stark concrete walls were bare except for dark shapes set into where the walls met the floor. James knelt, took another photo, and found the dark shapes were actually grates. They seemed to open into an even deeper area, though he couldn't see inside. Sewerage, maybe. Or ventilation. The grates were spaced 10 feet apart, and James tried to count them as he moved through the hallway. With only his camera to show him the way, it was easy to become disoriented and lose track of how far he'd come, but he'd passed at least 20 of the grates before the hallway ended. James, confused, stared at the photo of the empty wall in front of him. There was no door. There was no anything. The hallway simply ended, as though it had no greater purpose than to exist. James turned and took a photo of the length of the hallway, but he'd disturbed too much dust on his trip down, and couldn't make out anything except a blur of white. As he retraced his path up the hallway, James kept one hand on the wall while he held the camera in the other and skimmed through the photos he'd taken. He was cold and eager to get back outside, but as he neared the halfway mark of the hallway, he stopped. One of the pictures, one he'd taken to check he wasn't about to walk into anything, had focused on the walls rather than the dust motes, and it showed the grates a little more clearly than the other images had. And in one of the grates was... No, that can't be possible. But it looks so much like a face. James gasped as the bone-thin fingers, having slipped through the grate, fastened around his ankle and pulled. Next story. Skin House. Cold skin caressed Ron awake. He glanced towards the mottled hand draped across the pillow, squeezed his eyes closed, and rolled away from it. The fingers twitched, seemingly beckoning him back. He dipped his feet over the edge of the bed. Something scraped his toes as he slid them inside his slippers, and he recoiled with a barely muffled gasp. He turned the shoes over, and a dozen human molars clattered to the floor. Some rolled under the bed, others glittered on the polished wood. He considered not wearing the slippers, then resolutely pulled them over his feet and went to the bathroom. If you relent, you lose. 3 human fingers lay in the toothbrush holder. He ignored them as he took out his brush, even though one of them curled over at his touch. Ron watched his own face as he scrubbed his teeth. Human skin had been stretched over the wall behind him, and it pulsed from the effects of a non-existent heart, but he didn't stare at it. If you give it attention, you lose. The shower had hair tangled in its shower head. He tried pulling it free, but it had been woven through the tiny holes and refused to come out. Showering would still be possible, but it would mean letting the long, wet curls brush across his back. It was too much, even for him. He dressed and went downstairs. A human head stared at him from the second shelf of his fridge. It had been there the day before, too, and the mottled skin seemed to be puckering from where the refrigerated air was drying it. The blanched white eyes twitched to follow his movements as he retrieved leftover pizza. The flesh was blackening around the severed neck, and rotting fluid seeped from its open mouth, but he ignored it. He knew what was happening. It had happened to his mother, too. She'd been consigned to the madhouse before his 8th birthday, where she incessantly screamed about her blankets being made of human flesh and fingernails scratching over her legs as she sat in her chair. Insanity. If you give in to it, you lose. You go to the madhouse. You scream until you die. Ron sat at the small kitchen table and ate his pizza. A dismembered tongue rested among the stack of unopened letters, its moisture soaking into and discoloring the paper. Unlike his mother, he was holding it together. He'd inherited her insanity, but he'd learned from her mistakes, too. He wouldn't go shrieking to his neighbors about human body parts littering his home. As long as he kept his experiences to himself, the men in white coats would have no reason to visit. Will it eventually go away, or will it be like this forever? Something wet dripped onto his hand. He refused to look towards the ceiling, he didn't want to see what was seeping onto him. Instead, he dried his fingers on a tissue and shifted the chair a foot to the left. I'm not sure how long I can keep this up. It had started a week previously, when he'd found a severed toe on his living room floor. He'd almost called the police over it, except the toe had twitched. That clue had told him it was all in his head. If he called the police, they would come, and when he pointed at the twitching member, they would see nothing. And so he had to keep quiet about it. He had to ignore the steadily growing collection of human parts appearing around his home, to not let anyone suspect that he was cracking apart inch by inch. It was Monday. He would need to be at the school in an hour to welcome his class. The previous Friday, just before leaving for the day, he'd found an ear in his drawer. He'd managed to squash any reaction that would alert his students, but he was dreading what he might find there that morning. How bad will it get? There's more of it every day. Will my home eventually turn into nothing but an unholy collection of human fragments? He shook his head and closed his eyes. No. These images, these smells, these sensations, they're all in your head. They're not real, no matter how real they seem. You can endure. Just don't crack. Don't let anyone know. Faint, sing-song chimes ran through the hallway. Ron stood and turned towards the door. He could see a uniformed figure through the frosted glass. A delivery man, young and cradling a parcel, waited outside. Stay calm. Stay normal. Ron approached the door, then recoiled as his feet landed in something soft. The skin from a human's torso was draped over the hallway runner. He'd squashed it just above the belly button. It took immense willpower not to make a noise. He kept moving, stepping over the flesh and reaching for the door handle. Smile, Ron, he coached himself and exposed his teeth as he pulled open the door. Mr. Kilbourne, the delivery man asked, holding out his clipboard. A parcel for, what the hell? Ron followed the man's gaze. He was looking inside the apartment, his jaw slack and his eyes bulging, as he stared at the pulsing flesh covering the carpet. Oh, Ron said, uncertain whether to laugh or cry. Do you see it, too? Next story. Abandoned. From a distance, the collapsed tent looked almost identical to the dark rocks dotting the snow-blanketed slope. Angus didn't notice the flapping canvas until he was nearly on top of it. Angus paused, his walking stick raised in preparation for his next step, and stared at the structure. Mount Unglavia wasn't a popular mountain climbing destination, so he hadn't expected to see anyone else on his weekend trip. The tent had collapsed and become half buried by the snow, which didn't bode well for its occupant. Angus wasn't high enough for altitude sickness to be a serious concern, but there were still a multitude of other hazards that could maim or kill an unprepared climber. Angus quickened his pace, struggling through the knee-deep snow to reach the tent. "Hello?" he bellowed as he neared it, even though he didn't expect any answer. "Anyone hurt?" Silence. Angus circled around the tent before drawing closer and tugging on the canvas. To his shock, the fabric pulled away in a thin strip. Something had sliced through the tent's walls, and only the poles and the weight of the snow held the remainder of the structure together. What's strong enough to cut through this? Angus examined the frayed edges of the thick cloth. A knife could do it. Or maybe a bear, except there aren't supposed to be bears around here. Angus pulled on the fabric, throwing off the heavy layer of snow to see underneath. Any thought that the tent might have been abandoned due to a defect left him. Inside was fully stocked with food, spare clothes, and hiking equipment. Angus turned back to survey the harsh white landscape. The pine trees, spindly and dark green, were the only life he could see. The average climber would take more than a day to reach the mountain's base from Angus's current location. Whoever owned the tent surely wouldn't have gone down without his supplies, would he? A knapsack sat in the corner, nestled in the snow but still full of clothes and equipment. Angus swiped his gloved hand through the white powder coating the tent's floor and found the sleeping bag underneath. Angus didn't like to think about what had happened to the tent's owner. Mountaineering was a dangerous hobby, especially when done solo. Angus cast his eyes across the hills, wondering if the mystery climber's body was out there somewhere. The tent wasn't completely buried, which meant it must have been set up only a few days before. Still, a few days is a long time for someone to survive around here. The strangest part, though, were the slashed tent walls. Angus lifted parts of the canvas to examine the long, jagged gashes. He couldn't come up with any rational explanation for the damage. A gust of wind blew a thin flurry of snow across the landscape and batted it against Angus's hooded face. With the wind came a low, drawn-out moan. Angus turned towards the noise. He'd never heard anything like it before, but it somehow seemed to fit the bleak environment. He guessed it might have come from air being forced through a hole in a rock or possibly even a cave. It might have been some sort of wolf, though it sounded like no animal he'd ever heard before. The noise set his teeth on edge. Angus lurched to his feet and pulled the walking stick from where he'd propped it in the snow. "I'll tell someone about the tent when I get back to base. They'll have a challenge finding a body among these rocks, but if someone's been reported missing, it might be a little comfort to their family to know their last location." Angus readjusted his balaclava and turned to the path that led towards the mountain's top. The summit was no more than 4 hours away, 3, if the weather stayed good. The low, long moan echoed across the icy hills again, and Angus paused. "No, don't start thinking that. Just keep walking." He turned back to the woods, his eyes scanning the trees. But what if? What if it's the camper, hurt and calling for help? Angus shook his head and swiveled back to the path. The tent's been abandoned for days. No one can survive out here without shelter for that long. Are you certain, though? Are you willing to risk leaving a man to die up here if you're wrong? Angus turned back to the trees as he tried to figure out where the sound had come from. "Hello? Come on. You're building things out of proportion. And the sun's getting low. You'll need to keep moving if you want to reach the top of the mountain before sundown." Still, Angus hesitated. The noise came to him again, floating along the frigid air, its tone hollow, hungry, and raw. Angus swore and began jogging towards the woods. He had difficulty moving through the snow at a normal rate, running was nearly impossible. Even so, the sound was fading, and he wanted to find its source before he lost it again. He squirmed around an outcrop of rocks, and when he dropped into the sheltered hollow behind it, his foot landed on something that snapped under his weight. Angus felt his mouth dry. He stumbled backwards, lost his balance, and fell. Coiled into the sheltered hollow of the rocks was a human body, its limbs spread out and head lolled to one side. Angus recognized a popular brand of hiking jacket, though it had been unzipped to expose the belly underneath. Or what had once been the hiker's belly. The body had been eviscerated, its clothing shredded and its insides torn out. The organs were frozen solid on the ground, waiting for spring to thaw the snow and make them vulnerable to birds of prey and wild beasts. The face, perfectly preserved, held an expression of mingled shock and horror. The eyes bulged, and the mouth was open, though something seemed to have eaten its tongue. The wail came from the patch of woods behind Angus, and it sounded far, far closer than it had before. He turned slowly and faced the being that watched him from just behind the closest trees. Next story. Radio. The car horn blared, cutting through Luke's momentary distraction. He corrected his OODA and refocused on the narrow, twisting band of road as the car passed him in the opposite direction. The 20-minute drive through the mountain pass always left Luke jumpy. A high rock wall rose on his left side, where small sickly plants struggled to dig their roots into the granite. To his right was a drop-off, segregated from the road by a thin metal rail. Everyone, including Luke, took the mountain pass too quickly. The speed sign said 60 kilometers an hour, but he pushed the car to 75. The faster I get to the other side, the better. Moonlight, bright thanks to the full orb, flooded the road. It was well past midnight, and exhaustion was gnawing at Luke. All he wanted was to get to his friend's house, roll onto the couch he'd been promised, and sleep until midday the next morning. The car's left wheels vibrated as they ran over the gravel lining the edge of the road. Luke swore and corrected his path again. "I'm getting sloppy. We can't have that." He pressed his palm to the radio's button, and the jovial voice of a talk-show presenter filled the car. Pre-recorded, Luke thought, based on how buzzed the man's voice sounded. No one was that perky at 1 in the morning. The noise helped, though, and Luke let it wash over him as he focused his eyes on the road. For some reason, there was a second voice in the background of the station, talking a little too quietly for Luke to make out the words. Did they mess up the recording, or something? Maybe they're playing 2 tracks at the one time. It was both frustrating and distracting, and Luke changed the station. The new wavelength had party music, which they always seemed to play on Fridays. It wasn't his kind of tune, but beggars couldn't be choosers. There was something off about the songs, though, and it took Luke a moment to realize what it was. A man's voice in the background was throwing off the beat. That's the same voice that was on the other station. Maybe my radio's picking up interference. Luke scanned through 4 other stations, and each time, the voice came through, too faint to hear the words, but not quiet enough to ignore. Luke scowled at the radio, trying to figure out what was wrong with it, and a blaring car horn shocked him back to alertness. Geez, don't lose focus now. There's only 10 more minutes on this road, then you're back into the farmland. Pay attention. He'd left the radio on a dead space between stations. Strangely, though, the voice continued through the crackling static. Without other voices or music to distract him, Luke tried to make out the words. 18 dead, found, from the wreckage. Okay, so it's a news station, then. Luke reached out to turn off the radio, but then the static cleared, and the voice became clear. A private plane was shot out of the sky by Kyle King, who had drunkenly mistaken it for a large bird. The plane's pilot, Tom Jenner, died instantly. In Wisconsin, USA, Vivian Childs covered her heater with a blanket before going to bed, which started a fire while she and her family was asleep. All 3 died from smoke inhalation. John and Louise Redcliffe went scuba diving during their honeymoon in Bali. Louise's equipment malfunctioned, drowning her before she could reach the surface. In the West Isles, the hairs rose across the back of Luke's arms. It was nothing like any news station he'd heard before. The announcer's voice was unnervingly even and lacked any sort of nuance or emotion. The man sounded almost as though he were listing facts from a card. The deaths, a constant stream of them, seemed to have no relationship to each other. They spanned from Iceland to New Zealand and had a multitude of causes. In Cairns, Australia, Paul Favetta suffered a heart attack at his granddaughter's birthday party. The guests assumed it was a joke and only called an ambulance when it was too late to save him. In Vanuatu, Luke hit the radio's button, silencing it. What a weird station. Maybe it's a private project. Like some local got his hands on a radio broadcaster and is doing this as a sick joke or something. The radio crackled, and the monotonous voice filled Luke's car again. In New York, USA, 3 teenagers were shot in an alley by their classmate, Kendrick Heslop. Kendrick then turned the gun on himself. In Denmark, Mal Brogger choked on a fishbone. She lived alone and won't be found for 5 days. Wait, won't be found? Luke slammed his fist on the dash. Static filled the radio for a second but couldn't smother the unrelenting voice. Luke tried pressing the power button multiple times, but nothing stopped the monologue. What the hell? Luke spat. In Western Vale, Australia, Antonio Reynolds lost control of his vehicle while navigating a narrow mountain pass. He hit a Uta belonging to Luke Guerra. Both died instantly. Luke turned his eyes back to the road and gasped. Next story. Wax Museum. As Jared pulled his car into one of the dozens of empty parking spots, it was hard not to stare at the garish sign hung on the building ahead. Fat Clifford's fantastic wax sculptures, painted in bright carnival colors and exaggerated letters, seemed strangely irreverent that evening. Dark clouds had gathered to cover the moon, and a freezing wind tugged at Jared's coat as he left the car and approached the staff entrance at the back of the building. A tall, pinch-nosed woman was waiting for him inside. She exhaled audibly as he entered, then grabbed his sleeve and pulled him farther into the building. "You're the new guard, aren't you? Thank goodness. My daughter's birthday dinner is tonight, and I'm already late for it." "Oh, sorry, I thought I was on time." "You are. Here, keys to the building. I'll show you the security booth. You've done night guard work before, right?" Jared hesitated only a fraction of a second. Oh, yeah. In truth, it was his first time. He'd been surprised by how fast the process was. He'd applied that morning, had a phone interview in the afternoon, and been told to show up at 10 o'clock that night. He wasn't about to complain, though. His rent was 3 weeks overdue, and he would have shoveled trash if anyone had been hiring for it. Here. The woman, Simone, according to her name tag, ushered him into a small booth. 8 screens with black and white feed were set above a simple desk. "Did Clifford explain the job to you?" The interview had been so fast that Jared had barely gotten the address. "Watch the building. That's it in a nutshell." She pointed to the screens. "These wax sculptures are incredibly expensive. Keep an eye on them to make sure no one breaks in to steal or damage them. Watch the screens, and once an hour, walk through the building. Those are Clifford's express instructions. The screens capture most of the rooms, but the hourly walkthrough is very important to double-check everything is fine." And, Jared adjusted his tie, which suddenly felt too tight. "What happens if it's not?" Simone blinked at him. "Then you fix it." Look, I've got to go. I'm so late." "You'll be fine. Just do the walkthrough every hour and watch the screens. It's a stupidly simple job." Jared continued to fiddle with his tie as he listened to her footsteps fade and the metal staff entrance door slam. Just like the interview, his introduction to the job had happened so quickly that he felt as if he were trying to correct his balance on a constantly rocking boat. He stood in the booth for a few moments, half expecting someone would come back and give him a proper job description, then sighed and rubbed his hands through his hair. "It's cool. It's a stupidly easy job, like she said. You'll be fine." A torch stood on the desk by the screens, and Jared picked it up. He searched through the drawers in case he'd also been given a weapon, but there was no such luck. All that remained was a stick of gum, probably left there by the last guard. Without anything else to do, Jared turned on the torch and left the booth for his first walkthrough. It didn't take long for him to become hopelessly lost. Should have turned the lights on, he thought bitterly as he found himself at a dead end. However, Simone hadn't shown him where the switches were, and his narrow beam of light showed him only tiny slices of the space with each step. The wax museum was larger than he'd expected. At least a dozen rooms held countless wax figures, eerily lifelike and horribly plastic. He passed celebrities, historical figures, and even book characters. Every time he turned his torch, a new face was staring at him, fake eyes, hair, and smiles catching in the beam. Cold sweat trickled down Jared's back. During the interview, he'd been told the previous night guard had quit without notice, and he was starting to understand why. If he hadn't been desperate for the money, he would have walked out right then. As he continued farther into the house of shadowed, awkwardly posed models, he somehow found himself in a room of deformed figures. Their heads lolled at awkward angles, some were missing limbs, and others were partially melted. They had been arranged along the walls, all facing the door, their twisted visages enough to make Jared feel faintly sick. Suspecting the room wasn't part of the public tour, he backed out of the room. The glassy eyes and lopsided smiles followed him until he closed the door. It was an immeasurable relief when he caught sight of light coming from below the booth's door. He hurried to it and locked himself inside. The tie still felt too tight, so he loosened it some more, then pressed a hand over his heart. The guard's booth was small, but at least it was brightly lit. Jared slumped into the chair behind the desk and ran his hands over his face. He guessed the wax museum must be charming and interesting by day, when the lights were on and the signs were easy to read. At night, though, it had turned into something out of his worst nightmares. Jared was glad to be away from it. Well, mostly away from it. The 8 screens showed several of the horrific scenes in black and white night vision. For some reason, one of the cameras was pointed towards the storage room holding the deformed sculptures. Their eyes shone white through the camera, the way an animal's flash in the light. The chills wouldn't abate. Jared got to his feet, felt behind the screens, and pulled the plug he found there. The images disappeared in a faint whine, and the empty black was a relief in comparison. "I'll look for another job," Jared promised himself as he lolled back in the chair. "As soon as I get one, I can ditch this place. Maybe I just won't turn up one day, like that last chap. I don't know why this place even needs a security guard at night, anyway, and the hourly walkthroughs feel pointless. What can my presence achieve that a cheap motion sensor won't do more efficiently and for a fraction of the price?" Time seemed to crawl by. Jared had brought a novel, but he didn't feel like reading. Instead, he leaned back in the chair, folded his arms, and closed his eyes in an attempt to relax. He started awake some time later. It took him a moment to remember where he was, then he checked his watch. It was nearly 4 in the morning. His shift would only last for 2 more hours. His first emotion was guilt at failing to do what had been described as a stupidly simple job. His second was gratitude that he'd woken before his negligence could be discovered. He sat up in the chair and groaned as a pinched nerve in his neck made itself felt. SCCCRRTH, SCCCRRTH. Jared snapped his attention towards the booth's door. Something was scratching at its outside. His heart skipped a beat as he half rose out of the seat. He mouthed a swear word as panic hit. Jared scrambled for the back of the monitor system and replugged it. All 8 screens blinked for a second, then resumed their feed. He scanned them, but none of them showed the hallway outside the security booth. Crap. His nerves were hot. There was no phone inside the booth, and he'd left his mobile at home. There was no way to contact the outside world without leaving. Jared lifted his torch, base turned outwards to use as a bludgeon, and prepared to turn the handle. He held a small hope that it might be a prank, a welcome to the job hazing, but he was fully prepared to slam the door closed if it was anything else. He swung the door open, and the scraping fell silent. Outside the room stood a tall sculpture of a woman in a historical dress, her eyes directed towards Jared's face, her smile unnaturally wide. She was motionless, but her fingers were still extended, their strangely realistic nails held in the exact place they would need to be to scratch at the booth's door. Jared ran. His torch's beam jittered over walls, floors, and countless leering wax figures. They'd moved, he was sure. They no longer stood on their pedestals, but blocked the walkways. Jared ducked and wove about them, his heart ready to explode, and was certain he could hear shuffling footsteps behind him. The building was a maze, and he could have cried his relief when he recognized the hallway to the staff entrance. He burst through the metal door, dashed down the 4 steps to the car park, and threw himself into the only remaining vehicle, his car. As he turned towards the area's exit, he saw a man blocking the road. Jared slowed the car as he neared, and he realized the shape in the harsh beams of his headlights wasn't flesh and blood, as he'd first thought, but a wax figure. The man was tall and wide-set, wearing a blue coat, hands planted on hips, beady eyes staring unwaveringly at the car. A big name tag on his lapel read Fat Clifford. Jared had let the car come to a halt. A quiet click was all the warning he had that the passenger door had been opened. He looked to his side, where one of the deformed melted mannequins was halfway into his car, a contorted hand stretched towards Jared's tie. Without hesitation, he hit the accelerator. The car jerked forward, throwing the reaching wax figure out, and screeched towards Fat Clifford. The statue's wild smile didn't falter as the car hit it, knocked it down, and bounced over it. Jared sucked in thin, terrified breaths. He kept both feet pressed to the accelerator as he urged the car to take him as far from Fat Clifford's fantastic waxed sculptures as possible.